Welcome to the Canadian Business Quarterly podcast, where we speak with Canada's most influential industry leaders on the business and economic development issues taking place across the country. You can stay up to date with all of our content, including our publications, newsletters, and podcasts by visiting www.thecbq.ca and clicking on subscribe.
Today we're joined by Lorne Jackson, president of the Canadian National Christian Foundation. Lorne is a published author and public speaker on the subject of estate planning and donates his time to help Canadians think through their end-of-life decisions and be better stewards of all that they have been entrusted with. After 25 years in the financial services business, Lorne sold his company and left the for-profit sector in 2002 to create the Canadian National Christian Foundation, or the CNCF, a federally registered non-denominational public foundation. It now serves over 100 donors from across Canada and has invested more than $55 million in Canadian-based charities. In 2010, the Canadian National Christian Foundation began providing estate planning services to many charities, allowing them to assist their donors in arranging their wills in the most tax-effective way. So, Lorne, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Could you tell us about the background and the origins of the Canadian National Christian Foundation?
Sure. It worked like this. I was a broker-dealer in the financial planning world and had been doing that for a number of years. In fact, was probably more than 25, 30 years in the financial services sector. And then I sold the broker-dealer and left there in 2001. I took a year off to decide, okay, what's next? And I must say, as a Jesus follower, which I am, I happen to believe that God owns it all, including my time. So and plus the fact I'm not really a person who could just retire to do nothing or to play golf and tennis. Besides, my golf's not all that good anyhow. I would like to say I call myself not retired, but I'm rewired. I'm rewired to do something different. And I guess the foundation started because I was looking at how can I give back? What can I do to give back? So that was really kind of the background and how it got started. I might also say that when I sold my company, I received cash and public stock for the purchase of it. Some years before that, though, my wife and I had answered a very important question. And I think that's an important question anyhow, and that is, how much is enough? In other words, how much is enough to retire on? I worked in the financial sector long enough to know that lots of people never answer that question. So they're always looking for more, more, more. The answer would be more. And then more is never enough. So once we answered that, and then I sold the company, we received way more than enough. And I knew that money then was not mine, that's money that I needed to give away. So I used that in setting up the Canadian National Christian Foundation, because as you know, you can give public stock and you don't have to ever pay the tax on the capital appreciation of that stock. And it goes directly to the charity, in this case, CNCF, and CNCF no longer has to claim that gain either. So nobody ever has to pay that tax. So setting up CNCF just made perfect sense in allowing me to gift that to a public foundation.
How has the organization grown and changed over time since its setup?
Yeah, when we started the foundation, I thought that was all it was going to be, the Canadian National Christian Foundation. In fact, I must confess, I wasn't very excited about running it on a long-term basis because I thought, you just sit there and wait for people to give money, and that doesn't sound very exciting. But shortly after we started that, then we started doing estate planning for donors of many charities. And in fact, we have over 40 Canadian charities that we work with. And we also started teaching biblical finance to people in church circles. In other words, what does God's word have to say about money? In fact, if you look at the investment strategies of the world today, and you look at diversification and time, giving over time and all those kind of things, all that comes from the Bible. That's really where that comes from. So we have today over $500 million that will come into the foundation through estates. So all of a sudden, what I thought was just going to be a foundation and some people would give to, we're now helping people think through those end-of-life decisions and giving to their family. What's the most effective way to give and leave money to their family to try to prevent the tax? So that's kind of how it's grown and evolved, and never had imagined that when I started.
Fair enough. What makes the CNCF different from other public foundations?
Yeah, I would say we're hassle-free giving. That's where I would start. Many public foundations allow you to give, but they want to tie up the principal, and they say, well, you can give up to 5% a year to your favorite charity. We say, no, you can give whatever you want. So a donor can gift CNCF, a bunch of public stock. We sell it, turn it into cash, and then they could turn around and give it all out right away if they wanted. So it gives them a lot more flexibility. And we're not trying to hold on to donors' money like many of the public foundations I find across the country do. Our board is very big on getting the money into circulation, doing charitable work. So, and we're also, I would say, a more efficient way of giving than even a private foundation. Lots of times, high capacity donors may want to set up their own private foundation. There's a bit of a oxymoron with that because private is public and public is private anymore. If you have a private foundation, people can see what you're giving to, who you are. All they got to do is go on the CRA website and they can know everything they need to know about you and who you give to. And of course, part of the problem with that is if I'm a person who helps the poor and I've got a downtown mission operating, I'm going to go on your website or on the CRA website, and I'm going to find out that you give to the poor. Oh, hey, I'm going to approach you about giving to us. So it's not very private, even though the name is private. If you're using CNCF as a public foundation, they can't see that. All they see is how much money and to whom CNCF gave, but they don't know who did that. So it's much more private.
Okay. I believe that you said you work with over 140 donors now. Do you just want to give our audience an overview of who these donors are and what sort of net worth and monetary incomes we'd be talking about here?
Yeah, very interesting because most of the donors we would have would be business owners, or they have just sold a business, or they may have just sold a piece of real estate. And they have this huge tax issue this year. I remember one who came to me who had sold his business in Alberta, and he was concerned because it was October. He had this huge tax issue, and he called me up and he said, Lorne, I need to give away $2 million before the end of the year for tax purposes. If I gave you a house that I own in Montreal, and if I gave you $1 million worth of stock that I've just received, could you turn those into cash and give me a receipt for that before the end of the year? Now, remember, it was October, and he would never be able to sell his house in time to do that. So we had an appraisal done of the house, said, yes, it's worth $1.1 million. We sold the house, by the way, 9 months later, which is an aside story, but we did, and he turned that into cash. But the neat thing for this guy was he was able to receive his charitable receipt before the end of that calendar year so he could use it in his taxes. But he didn't give the money out to the charities he wanted to support until 1, 2, 3 years later. So much more flexibility. And real estate gifts, you notice he gave real estate as well. So we were able to give him a tax receipt for his real estate in October, right when he gifted us the real estate. But we didn't have cash from it until the next year in June. We actually sold it. So that was a lot more flexibility as well. And then You'll notice he also gave us public stock for the other $1 million. Well, that was a good thing for him to be able to do because there was a huge gain on it. Well, he never had to claim that gain then, so that worked out for him well as well. And then one other thing, a lot of our donors have come by a financial advisor bringing them to us because we allow the financial advisor that is managing the money. So let's suppose that a donor has $1 million or he's got $500,000 in a mutual fund or some kind of an investment with a financial planner. That financial planner can now manage that money for us so that the donor gets the receipt immediately when the ownership of that fund turns over to CNCF. But the financial advisor who brought them to us is able to manage that money and invest it for them or for us on our behalf rather than the donor now. So the donor gets to see that, okay, hey, I like my financial advisor. I like the way he invests. Okay, good. We'll continue to use him or her. And then one more. We do have life insurance policies. CRA has put it in place where you can donate a life insurance policy to a charity and get a interesting tax receipt depending on the size of that life insurance, how long it's been in force, and so on. But it would have an actuarial calculation that would say, here's what it's worth for tax purposes, and they can get a tax receipt right away for that as well. So I would say our donors are primarily business owners who have made some change in their business. They've sold a piece of it off, they sold a piece of real estate, but whatever it is, they got a huge tax issue, and we can help them.
There is, still with a lot of people I speak to, there's a lot of misconception around the concept of writing off income within a business. Could you just very briefly explain, how this tends to benefit businesses during tax time?
Yes. Well, simply, you're getting a charitable tax receipt. Now, when it's business, they actually get a tax receipt. If it's a personal one, they get a tax credit. A credit is a little bit different. The receipt is actually better in most cases. So you get a charitable receipt. That just means you don't pay tax on that amount of money as a corporation. So you could gift. See, here's the thing. If they gift us public stock and the stock has got an increase in value, let's say 30%, they never pay tax on that 30% increase, where if they had sold it first and then gifted us the after-tax residue, they would have had to pay tax on that 30% gross capital gain tax. Well, by gifting the stock, they don't have to pay that tax. And because charity doesn't pay tax, they now have the 30% increase, but they don't have to pay tax. So it benefits the donor in a number of ways. They're able to give more than they could normally give because of that. And now they've got a tax receipt that's worth 30% more than they actually paid for this thing, which they never had to claim tax on. So it's really a win-win for the donor and the charity.
Are there any other asset classes that have the benefit of stocks, or is that relatively unique compared to other classes?
Yeah, that is unique, unfortunately. We did have a government at one time that was considering allowing the same thing for real estate that had increased in value, but we have never seen that come to fruition. So stock is really the only one you can do that with, or mutual funds. Okay.
People come to you with a problem, or they say, look, we have this and we're willing to give this. Can you talk about the process of how you liaise with your clients and how you work with charities? Do they know where they want to put the money? Are they entrusting you to do that? What is that process, and who do you work with?
Yeah, I would say that most of the money that's in the foundation today and the money that flows through the foundation on an annual basis, because we have a lot of the money that comes into CNCF would go out in the same year it comes in, the bulk of it, because that's just the way we are, I guess. But I would say that most of that comes from people who have found us either through a referral, or, as I said, their financial advisor has brought them to us, and then they just keep adding money to that donor-advised fund every year. And then we give that out to the charities that they choose in their timing that they choose. The charitable work that we do with helping estates, helping with people with their estates, that won't necessarily flow through the foundation. That we're there to help the donor make the right decisions for themselves and their family. And by the way, often when we do that, giving to charity is a good thing. But having it flow through the foundation may not even happen. It may just go directly to the charities that we work with. Like we work with Compassion Canada, we work with Billy Graham or Samaritan's Purse Organization, Trinity Western University, Tyndale University, just to name a few. So their donor wouldn't necessarily put it through the foundation out of their estates. Their estate may say, I want to give this to Samaritan's Purse or Compassion Canada. It doesn't come to us at all. And that's okay. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to help the donor make wise decisions for themselves and their family. And yet in doing that, we happen to know that there is, as I said earlier, over $500 million that will flow through CNCF someday from these estates. So some people do, some people don't.
And you had talked about making the right or assisting in making the right choice for your donors. Are there typical questions or concerns that are initially raised that you find yourselves dealing with?
Yes, we talk about three things primarily, or we look for three things. One would be, what are the assets that we can pass directly to a beneficiary without having to go through probate, executor fees, legal fees, all those kind of fees that can come out of your estate? Are there assets that you could pass directly to the beneficiary? Yes, there are. For example, life insurance. If it's to a named beneficiary rather than a estate, then it doesn't go through your will. Or another one would be your RRSP or RIF. If you have a named beneficiary, if you have a spouse and your spouse is named as your beneficiary, it goes directly to them and does not go through your estate. So we're always looking for ways to keep the fees down. The other thing we would be looking for is RRSPs themselves. Many people don't think about their RRSP when they're doing their will planning, and their RRSP would just be lumped in with everything else. So in other words, they would have a beneficiary that says, my spouse receives my RRSP if anything happens to me, but there's no thought beyond that. So if the spouse has predeceased you and the money now flows into your estate, guess what? That gets taxed heavily because it's a different class of asset than any other asset you own. All our other assets, we only pay tax on the growth. RRSP, we pay tax on everything. So when that falls into my estate at the end of life, it gets added to my income on my final tax return in addition to all other income I've had that year. So you may find your estate may find itself in the top tax bracket, and that's not what they intended. So those are some of the things we look for.
Are there any, because you work with charities and probably see a lot of the issues that affect everyday people in need of help, are there any particular causes that you believe are in greater need of attention, or were you, I suppose for lack of a better term, might give preferential treatment to because of the necessity for need?
Yeah, I wouldn't say preferential treatment necessarily, but I certainly think that the cause that gets me or gets my heart the most is the poor, helping the poor. And of course, I did a study one time in the Bible about all the verses that say about how God blesses those who help the poor, and I very quickly decided maybe I'd like to help the poor. but I think there is a huge need there. And one of the best organizations I think of that we work with anyhow in that area is Opportunity International Canada, and they're the microfinance. They're probably the largest microfinance organization in Canada. And of course, we all know about microfinance and how they can I can make a donation of $1,000. They can loan that $1,000 out to somebody in a third world country. The people buy a sewing machine or they buy a cornmeal grinder or whatever, and they are able to sell what they make with that and now have a reasonable lifestyle, get their kids educated, all those things. I've gone on some of those trips, and they're just amazing what it does for people in those third world countries. So I think microfinance is a huge benefit to those in third world countries, and I think helping the poor that's probably one of the best ways to do it, because it's talking about teaching a person how to fish rather than just keep giving it to them.
Yes. You've already been touching on some of this stuff through informing us of tax implications, but we normally ask our guests these questions around things like industry and legislative issues. Is there anything taking place that, people like myself would generally be unaware of, but are affecting, what you do?
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in that area. Back in 2014, the government changed a lot of rules on estates. It's worked out okay now. It was pretty tough at the beginning, but they had to revamp some things. Unfortunately, I don't think they did all the homework they probably should have done in checking out how things actually work. So sometimes sitting in an office in Ottawa, where I am, you may misunderstand how things actually work. But one of the things that concerns me greatly and has concerned the charitable industry greatly is there has been, from time to time, rumblings about taking away the tax receipts for charitable giving. In other words, not giving any tax receipt for charitable giving. And when you look at countries like Europe, they don't have charitable receipts for or tax receipts. They could give to charity, but they don't get a receipt for it. So I think that would really hurt the charitable world here. I think it would be catastrophic for a lot of the charities in Canada if they ever did that. So I hope they stay away from that. And the other one I would say is CRA really needs to allow donating real estate and then be able to transfer that capital gain on it to the charitable giving or the charitable organization they're giving to. I think that's one that was on the docket at one point, but then kind of fell off when the government's changed, and they need to bring that one back. So those are two that come to mind readily.
Okay. Lorne, that's it from the questions on my end. Before we finish up today, is there anything that you'd like to add or finish off with?
Well, yeah, just one thing. I, as a charity leader myself, I often look at all these things and say, okay, what about giving? What do I need to know as a donor? I find it interesting that giving generously is a very small crowd, quite frankly. And I think the reason for that is we tend to think that our money is like pizza. If I have a pizza and I give you a piece, I got less for me. Well, actually, the Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says money is like seed. In fact, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament said that a farmer who plants only a few seeds would get a small crop, which makes sense. But then he says, but one who plants generously would get a generous crop. Well, in that particular area of the Bible, he's talking about money as he comes into that. And then he says, you must each decide in your heart how much to give, and don't give reluctantly, because God loves a cheerful giver. So I would say we need to remember that money is like seed. If you want a lot, you need to sow a lot. And that doesn't mean spending it. That means giving it to help others.
Well, Lorne, thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you. I really appreciated the opportunity. This has been good.
This has been a production of the Canadian Business Quarterly, a division of Romulus Rising Proprietary Limited. All rights reserved. You can stay up to date with the Canadian Business Quarterly, including our publications, newsletters, and podcasts by visiting www.thecbq.ca and clicking on subscribe.